If you are watching this video, it means you're probably looking into starting an army for Warhammer the Old World. But you don't want to be like those mainstream conformists, you're looking for something more dark and brooding and more unsupported by GW.
Everyone's just walking around like a bunch of conformists. Go ahead and wear your business suit so you can make $34,000 a year and buy your condominium. They're all zombies racing to their graves.
But not you. You want to be the zombie master. However, before you rush out to buy the Cure's greatest hits and master your Nosferatu impression, there are a few things you should know before starting a Vampire Counts army. The first thing you need to know if you somehow missed it is that Vampire Counts are a legacy army for Warhammer the Old World. And what that means is that at some point during development, Games Workshop made a conscious choice to choose certain factions from Warhammer Fantasy to support in the Old World and other factions to not support. As one of these unsupported or legacy factions, the Vampire Counts received a PDF at the very launch of Warhammer the Old World. The lore reason that GW gave for this decision is that the vampires are still recovering from the vampire wars that took place shortly before the timeline of Warhammer the Old World. And thus the vampires are mostly in hiding and not a major player in the Old World as the timeline stands. However, this really makes no sense within their own lore. Even if the vampire wars absolutely decimated the von Karstein line, there would be other vampire bloodlines that still would be active in this period. On top of that, the Vampire Counts were basically in the same situation for all the editions of Warhammer Fantasy. After the Vampire Wars, for the most part, the Vampire Counts stayed in hiding waiting for their time to strike. They really didn't make themselves known until the kickoff of the end times when Manfred announced his return. But worse than that, even if there aren't any vampires active, there's always going to be deranged necromancers that could lead armies. In fact, one of GW's most famous necromancers, Dieter Helsnich, was supposed to be active during the time of this game. And not only is he beloved by the fan base and being constantly asked to be added to Total War, but he has major lore implications for the Empire, meaning that the Vampire Counts are not as inactive as GW would like them to be for this period. We could have had a really cool edition of Vampire Counts for the Old World where it focused more on necromancers or even other bloodlines besides the von Karsteins, but leave it to GW to miss out on a good opportunity. So the lore justification for this is pretty mangled, but honestly the real life reason for this is pretty mangled as well. The dominant rumor seems to be that GW pits their internal teams against each other, and they want to be able to tie back cells to a certain game. So the reason armies like the Vampire Counts were included in the Old World is because so many of their sculpts can still be used in Age of Sigmar. And they don't want to be in a situation where a customer buys a kit and doesn't know what game it's applied to. And if you're thinking to yourself, that's incredibly stupid, wouldn't it ultimately be better to sell more kits and not know which of two game systems it goes to than sell less kits overall? Then congratulations, you're smarter than the MBAs that run GW. But regardless of whether it was right or if it was wrong, Vampire Counts are in fact a legacy army. And what that means in practicalities of what you can expect is don't expect any new units ever. Don't expect the rules you have to ever be updated, and don't expect a lot of rule clarity in future FAQs. What exists right now is essentially what's going to exist as long as this system goes on. The army is every bit as dead as the vampires you're going to paint to lead them. The main risk from this is one of power creep. As other armies get updates and new units, GW has a tendency to creep the power scale of the game. And if your army in particular is not getting updates, you're going to be further and further behind. So for a historical example, both Bretonnia and Tomb Kings had rules for the launch of Age of Sigmar. But these rules were legacy, they were never updated, and they never grew with the game as GW tinkered with the rules, changed things, and added new units. They fell so far behind that it was just no fun to use those rules anyways. You just couldn't make it work. And then after a certain amount of time, GW just stopped allowing you to use those legacy rules at all. The same thing could happen with legacy armies in the Old World, I guess. That's not guaranteed to happen, and any updates that are coming for the old world are coming incredibly slow, just as the dwarf players who are still waiting for their army release. You will also never receive an official arcane journal from GW. The arcane journals are little supplement books that give a little bit of more lore on the background of the supported factions and a few different ways to build those armies. For example, in the Bretonnia book, there exists a new way to build Bretonnia as Bretonian exiles, where you can include things like cannons. I also strongly suspect that as more and more supported factions get their arcane journals, GW will start releasing campaign books, and vampire counts will never be a part of those as well. That all being said, vampire counts are perfectly playable right now. With the right list composition, they're actually very competitive. And if it hasn't happened already, someday a fan will release an unofficial Vampire Counts Arcane Journal that will be better than anything GW itself would have produced. You just have to convince your playgroup to let you use it. Another thing to keep in mind before making an army of the damned is how you're going to source your models. Because the Vampire Counts are a legacy army, GW is not going to repackage the old models that they had in Warhammer Fantasy. However, as luck would have it, a lot of the old models are still being sold on the GW website under Age of Sigmar, under either Night Haunts or Soulblight Gravelords or whatever edgy name they're giving their undead now. The only concern really is sourcing square bases from round bases. It's also probably worth noting that while GW still sells versions of skeletons and zombies and baseline troopers, these aren't the original kits that came for Warhammer Fantasy. These have been updated for Age of Sigmar. And that is relevant because the Age of Sigmar minis were not made to rank up. They have all very dynamic poses because they're meant to be more scattered about in the battlefield. In practice, this means that even with the increased base size of the old world, you might have a hard time getting your little toy soldiers to rank up. And even if you do, these new dynamic models don't look so much like they're a group of well-trained soldiers moving in uniform like a unit should. They all look like they're doing their own thing. This fits pretty well with zombies, but lore-wise, the skeletons should be moving around like automatons, almost in lockstep with one another. These new sculpts are also more ornate, which means they take longer to paint than your old line troops, which is great for a hero or a champion, but it kind of sucks when you're trying to put together 80 zombies. That all being taken into consideration, the AOS sculpts are actually really cool, and even some of the Night Haunts you can proxy for some things in your Vampire Count army that will look really cool. And if you don't like them, the older skeletons and older zombies and basically older Vampire Count units that aren't in production anymore are still pretty cheap to get your hands on. The only expensive Vampire Counts units that aren't being produced are the vampire characters themselves. And speaking of vampires, while the new GW vampire sculpts are really cool, they are wildly out of scale of what they would be if they were made for Warhammer Fantasy. Take the Bruiser from the Crimson Court, for example. I believe he is a beautiful sculpt. He's exactly what I think an out and proud, brutal vampire should look like. I love the sculpt, but it is way too big for me to use. He's scaled to be like 9 feet tall. I mean, even the model of Vlad, who is a large man and a dominant vampire, is about nipple high on this guy. It just looks comical to put him into a Warhammer Fantasy army. He's too big. So basically, if you are going to start a Vampire Counts army at this point, I almost guarantee you will have to supplement your official GW models with third-party models either from Etsy, from the Little Cottage Industry 3D printing, or with competitors to Games Workshop. For example, Fireforge makes amazing zombies that are incredibly affordable and add a little bit of variety to your armies. Moving on to how they actually play in the game, this is not the Vampire Counts you remember. In my limited experience, it feels like Vampire Counts are one of the most changed armies from the move to 8th edition to the old world. And in my opinion, they really stray away from their army fantasy. I'm guessing when you think of a Vampire Count's army, you see a large horde of skeletons and zombies overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers, being led by a deranged vampire and slutty female vampires the way God intended. But this kind of army composition just doesn't work out very well in the old world. For starters, Vampire Count's infantry has a major mobility problem. It's fair to say that's true for all armies in the old world. This is very much a cavalry and monster focused edition, but it is especially true for Vampire Counts. Your terrifying horde of skeletons and zombies can only move 4 inches each turn, and they no longer getting a boost from being in close proximity to your commander. This means you are incredibly reliant on necromancers casting hellish vigor to get your skeletons going anywhere. And you're also pretty reliant on a mortis engine, which does have an aura which adds an extra inch to your infantry movement, which means 1 or 2 mortis engines is probably required in a large game. After a few games of doing that, it will probably dawn on you that the more efficient way to play the Vampire Counts is to focus on their faster moving monsters, bats, and blood knights. And that's probably the way you're going to have to play Vampire Counts if you're playing in the old world. It is no longer about your hordes of undead. It's not even really about your vampires anymore. They are kind of meh this edition. In previous editions, the funnest part about Vampire Counts was the Blunderlord, right? Was your melee-focused Vampire Count on foot who would just decimate anything they come across. That doesn't really exist anymore. Outside of putting a vampire on a dragon, they're really not all that scary. And you're going to want to rely on necromancers more than vampires just because you need the extra magic. It should be noted that in this edition, vampires cannot be a level 4 wizard, only necromancers can. That's not to say that there aren't aspects of the army that don't play out true to lore. Your blood knights are fast and strong and scary, even if they are kind of glass cannons. And probably my favorite aspect, it is easier than ever to revive your dead units in this edition of the game. Your opponent can no longer stop you from reviving the undead through counterspells. The trade-off of this, of course, is that you can no longer grow a unit past its starting size. Zombies can have 40 units and no more, which is a bit of a nerf, but on the other hand, it's going to save you a lot of time painting a lot of goddamn zombies. And while the army in its current iteration is extremely monster focused and cavalry focused, it is competitive in this way. I don't want to get into all the details here because it's fair to say I'm not necessarily a tournament player and I don't understand them, but there is something called a Scream list that uses a lot of banshees and a lot of undead dragons to win tournaments. And for most people who are just playing in a more casual setting, Vampire Counts, even played the traditional way with a lot of skeletons and a lot of zombies, can still be competitive enough to have a fun and loreful game. I know in this video I gave you a lot of negative things to think about before you start an army, but I will say right here, I do think out of all the legacy armies I've tinkered around with or have read about people tinkering around with, Vampire Counts are in better shape than most. As long as you are okay with the potential drawbacks that I outlined, you should absolutely get your goth on and create your army of the damned. As always, thanks for watching.